All right, so a couple things before we get started here. I wanted to mention, so module 4, come down here. We've got CL sessions tonight and on Monday. So I was just asked a question. I'll probably put up an announcement on Canvas. One of those locations Monday changed. I believe it's the biology one is now in Woodburn, room 111. So I'll make sure I get that file updated that's on Canvas that replaces that. Put up an announcement that kind of addresses that change. But it's just that one location moved to a different room to make it easier for the leader. This week, after today's class, you will have that module 4 quiz open up, due at the end of the day, Monday. There will be no module reading, right? Because next week is what? The exam is a week from today. So we'll have a review class on Tuesday. We'll kind of dive into these practice exams, which after last class, I put up a second practice exam. So I'll go more kind of through how I would kind of study, kind of what I would review on Tuesday's class. But basically, the first thing I would start out with are these two practices, right? And I'm giving you these questions for a reason. They look the most similar to what you'll see on the actual exam. And if you have a chance to look at them prior to next Tuesday's class, really, I'm going to ask you for questions first. I want to be making sure I'm working through the problems that you guys have questions on first. If I run out of questions, I might start picking and choosing the ones that I think are maybe useful to go over. But you know, it's a good time for you to be able to ask questions in class. Now, I also have my office hours next Monday. If you're starting to think about reviewing and kind of preparing for that exam. My office hours Wednesday are likely going to be moved a little bit further into the day. So they're usually in the mornings. I've got some commitments in the morning I'm not 100% sure on yet. And it's likely that those office hours will move to be a little bit later in the day. Okay, so more likely to be in the afternoon than the morning of next Wednesday. Okay, but I'll still have the same number of hours available. Other than that, those help sessions in Wiley Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday nights. The Thursday one doesn't really help us next week, but you go tonight as well. Those would be a good time to kind of go review, ask questions as you're working through these practice exams. Other than that, any questions for me before we get going here? Okay. So the other thing I wanted to mention before we start, and I'll put up an announcement probably about this, but I've got these kind of two files, and I put like in the module 4 experiment files. There's some experimental economists that do some experiments to try to get at basically are consumers behaving in a way that would line up with the theory. And so I don't know exactly how much it pays per hour. Probably has more information on here. Basically, your performance in the experiments like dictates like you make more or less money. And so I think it's probably the average is like around $12, $15 an hour for participating in these. But if you pull this open, it gives you a QR code that would kind of take you to where you can register, right? And then it gives you like available times and days where you could be participating in these experiments. I told the researcher who's doing this that I kind of make this available to you. Say the researcher, he's also a professor here. If you have any questions about that, you can kind of ask me, you know, another after class or email me about it. But I wanted to make you aware of that. I put those up there. It's additional kind of opportunity for you outside of this class. All right. Other than that, any other questions? We'll jump into these slides. So I moved the order a little bit. So if you downloaded these like Monday, I updated them after class Tuesday just based off what we covered because we're going to go through things in a slightly different order, but it's the same content, same slides. So the one that's currently on Canvas, I posted it up last Tuesday or after class Tuesday, has kind of that change in ordering. Okay, so if you're working with the current one, you're fine. All right. So, any other questions? Kind of dive in right where we left off. Okay. So, we talked about last class at the end that we can look at different goods and talk about which goods are more or less elastic. But even if we're on the same demand curve, different points on that demand curve would have different elasticity measures. So we said in general, and this might be good, as I'm moving down the demand curve, if I'm moving down, I'm getting closer to a value of 0. So when a good has an elasticity of 0, elasticity measures the responsiveness of consumers to price changes. So if the elasticity is 0, that means they're perfectly inelastic. They're not responding at all. So as we move down the demand curve, demand is becoming more and more inelastic. So just kind of from some very, very basic numbers, if I have a linear demand curve, the slope is always the same, right? For a linear demand curve. How would I calculate slope? It's the change in the y over change in x, or change in price over change in quantity. When we calculate elasticities, we said it's completely inversely related to slope, right? So here, how do I calculate elasticity? It's the percentage change in my quantity demanded over a percentage change in my price. So if I were to kind of work through these values, if I go from a price of 30 to 20, I'm convincing this consumer to go from buying nothing to buying 20 units. I could use these values to calculate my percentage change in quantity and percentage change in price by using what method? Midpoint method. What is the mid? I just look at the change. If I want the percentage change in quantity divided by the average of those two values. Same thing for price. If I want the percentage change in price, I would take that change in price of 10 divided by the average of what? 25 here. And that would give me my percentage change in price. So initially, if I were to calculate those values, I end up with a 200% change in the quantity demanded and a 40% change in my price. So I have an elasticity of 5. Would I say that this is elastic or inelastic? Elastic is greater than 1, right? That percentage change in my quantity demanded, it's even larger than the initial change in price. Okay. Now, as I move down the demand curve, it should become more and more inelastic. So if I instead lowered the price from 20 to 10, and quantity went from 20 to 40, if I use the midpoint method to calculate elasticity there, I end up with a elasticity that's exactly 1. We said we would call this unit elastic. Every percentage change in the price was perfectly matched by a percentage change in the quantity demanded. And then if I calculate it kind of down here, moving from price of 10 to 0, I end up with an elasticity of 0.2. I would say demand is inelastic. So as I move down the demand curve, my elasticity measure in absolute value is getting closer and closer to 0, or my demand curve is becoming more and more inelastic. That's kind of where we left off last class. I use some different values. I'm going to use like 199 and 1 and 2 just to like really get at this idea. But we could do this for any demand curve. So the unit elastic point is somewhere in the middle. The elastic portion will be any prices above that. Inelastic portion, any prices below that unit elastic point. So why do we care about this? Well, because depending on where we're at in the demand curve, it has different suggestions for a company about whether they should increase or decrease the price of their product, right? Or elasticity is going to be directly related to our total revenues as a firm. So if we think about this, how would I calculate total revenue? Simply the quantity I'm selling times the price I'm selling that good for, or price times quantity. Okay? So I've got some additional slides here where we'll kind of walk through this, but I think it might help first to kind of set it up this way. All right. So total revenue is price times quantity. So let's say I had elastic demand. I know that my elasticity of demand is the percentage change, or price elasticity of demand, percentage change in the quantity demanded of that good over the percentage change in price. And if it's elastic, that would be greater than 1 in absolute value. Okay. So if that's the case, what has to be true about my percentage change in the quantity demanded relative to my percentage change in price? What's the only way this fraction is above 1? If the numerator is relative to the denominator greater. We know how to understand why a fraction is greater than 1. Okay? So if that's the case, if we have elastic demand, if I increase the price by a little bit, what's going to be true about the response by consumers? They're going to buy a lot less, right? So that percentage change in the quantity demanded, I'm trying to use the proportion of these arrows to kind of get at this relationship, right? Well, when I sell the product for a higher price, I'm going to increase total revenues. But if as a result of that, yes, I'm making more on each unit I sell, but if I'm selling way less units, that impact on total revenue is going to be that's decreasing total revenue. So if I have elastic demand, that thing that is decreasing total revenue is going to be the one that kind of wins out, right? Or the effect that dominates. Now, if I'm on instead the inelastic portion of my demand curve, so there I still have kind of elasticity measured the exact same way, but now it is less than 1 in absolute value. What must now be true about the percentage change in my quantity demanded relative to my percentage change in price? The only way this fraction is less than 1 is if the denominator is larger. So now let's assume we have the same thought experiment. If I increase the price as a company, I could increase it by a lot, and the corresponding response would be people buy just a little bit less, right? In fact, I'll go through an example here in a second where we're thinking about perfectly inelastic demand to kind of make this point, but for right now, just inelastic. So which of these effects is larger? The thing that is increasing total revenues. So there, if I'm on the inelastic portion, increasing the price actually has a complete opposite effect on total revenues than if I increase the price on the elastic portion of demand. So as a company, if I want to increase the price, what portion of the demand curve do I hope I'm on? Well, I want revenues to be higher or lower? Higher, so I hope that if I'm increasing price, I'm on the inelastic portion. In fact, we could go through a more extreme kind of example of this. Let's say I had perfectly, the elasticity is equal to 0. It's the lowest possible value. That would be the lowest possible response by consumers. So here I would have perfectly what? So if it measures how responsive consumers are, if it's 0, that means people are not responding at all. Perfectly inelastic. Okay? If that was the case, let's think about what's happening to total revenues. If I increase the price, what's happening to the change in the quantity demanded if it's perfectly inelastic? We said this is like drugs. Even if the price goes up, people keep buying the same amount. So what's definitely going to happen to my total revenues if its demand is perfectly inelastic? There's no change in quantity, but I'm increasing the price, I definitely see total revenues go up. Kind of lines up with the same thing as if it is inelastic, just an even more extreme example. Okay? Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Another one we could think about, what if I had unit elastic demand? What does that mean about my percentage change in quantity demanded relative to my percentage change in price? They're exactly the same, right? The only way I get a fraction that's equal to 1 is if the numerator and denominator are the same. So there, if I increase the price, it's matched exactly by a decrease in what's happened to my total revenues. Stayed the same. I had completely offsetting effects. So we can, I don't know, I think it helps to kind of use these arrows and think about what the equation is to solidify this idea. We'll give you a more continuous graph here later on and a couple different ways of thinking about this. Okay. But for now, I like to introduce it this way. You know, if you try to rote memorize stuff for this exam, it's a lot to memorize, right? So I think it's more of understanding the concepts, right? And being able to kind of reproduce these for yourself. Okay? So I'll just give you different ways, though, to think about this relationship of elasticity and total revenues. So here, I took the same demand curve, nice and linear, right? Here it would have a slope of -1. As I lower the price, what is happening to my total revenues? So if I started out at a price of 5 and I lower it to 4, well, at a price of 5, how many units was I selling? 0. So my total revenue would be 0. If I lower the price to 4, I'm now selling a unit, so my total revenues would be 4 times 1 or 4. What's happened to total revenues? They went up. When I was on the elastic portion of the demand curve, we just worked through examples where if I increased the price, it caused total revenues to decrease. Here I'm doing the opposite. If I see instead of a price increase, a price decrease, when demand is, and I have the values negative here, just to be transparent, on the quiz or exam, I'll always give you the absolute value. So if we actually calculate this, it would always be negative. We said just to make it easier to talk about like directional changes. We're always just concerned with the price elasticity of demand, just to be looking at the absolute value. So here in absolute terms, is it greater than 1? Yes, we're on the last portion. So by lowering the price, we actually are increasing total revenues. And I can calculate these percent changes, just like we were talking about before, using that midpoint method. As long as I have the two prices, as long as I have the two quantities, I can take the change divided by the average and calculate those percentage changes. As we start to move down the demand curve, it should become more and more what? Closer to 0, more and more inelastic. So notice when I go from a price of 4 to 3, same price decrease, I now convince the consumer to buy a second unit. What's happened? I'm lowering the price. It's still elastic. So my total revenues should be going up. Right? In fact, if I just do price times quantity, they're increasing. Now notice though, when demand was more elastic, what happened from that same price decrease? Total revenues went from 0 to 4 instead of from 4 to 6. So the change in total revenue is even larger when demand is more elastic. And then as we kind of continue to move down, there's a unit elastic point. If I lower the price through 2, what's happened to my total revenues? Same thing we said before. I'm on the unit elastic portion, they don't change at all. And then if I continue to move down to lower and lower prices, now I'm on the inelastic portion, in absolute terms less than 1. Now if I continue to lower the price, so I set up an example first where we were increasing prices. You can go in the exact opposite direction, which is what we're doing here, which is just lowering the price. So when I was on the elastic portion, lowering the price was causing total revenues to go up. Once I end up on this inelastic portion, lowering the price now is doing what to my total revenues? Decreasing. So we can prove this concept to ourselves with some actual value, an actual demand curve. Any questions? I've got another visual way of representing this to you here in a second. Okay, so we already talked through all that. So kind of the summary of that, right, is depends on whether or not I should increase or decrease the price, depends on whether or not demand is currently elastic or inelastic. Okay, here's another way of thinking about it. Let's say I charged a price of $4. How many units would I be selling? Well, at $4, the point at the demand curve is a quantity of 1. So what would my total revenues be? 4. If I lower the price to 3, how many dollars am I losing on that first unit? I was selling for 4, I'm now selling it for 3, so I've lost $1. But I've convinced the consumer at this lower price to buy a second unit. Right? When I sell the second unit, I'm now selling it for $3, so I lost $1 in the first unit, but I'm gaining $3 by now selling a second. So am I better or worse off than before? If I gained $3 but lost 1, my net gain was $2. I'm better off. I've increased my total revenues by lowering that price. What must be true is that if that's true, I must be on the elastic portion of my demand curve. If I instead lower the price from $3 to $2, well, I was before at $3 selling 2 units. So how much am I losing on each unit? By lowering the price by $1 on each unit, I'm losing $1. If I was selling 2 units, I'm losing $2. But I've now convinced this consumer at this lower price to buy a third unit. At a price of $2, how much am I making now on the third unit? $2. So here, when I have unit elastic demand, yes, I'm losing money per unit because I'm charging a lower price, but I'm also gaining revenue because I'm selling more units. If those exactly kind of offset each other, I've got unit elastic demand. Now, if I continue to lower the price, I go below $2 here, what portion of the demand curve am I going to be on? As we move down the demand curve, it becomes more and more inelastic. So past that unit elastic point, I now know I'm on the inelastic portion. By going and charging a price of 2 to 1, how much am I losing on each unit I was selling before? I'm losing $1 on each unit. So for the first 3 units, I've now lost $3, but I've convinced the consumer to buy 1 more unit. I'm gaining $1. Well, here I gained $1, lost 3. Am I better or worse off than before? Worse off. I've lowered my total revenues by $2. So just another way, another visual representation to think about how the elasticity of our demand curve, if I lower the price, it has completely opposite effects. When I'm on the inelastic portion, lowering the price will decrease my total revenues. Whereas when I was on the elastic portion, it was increasing my total revenues. All right, so I've got one other way of thinking about this, but are there any questions on anything here before we keep moving? Okay. So we'll kind of use some more simple examples here with some integer values. So I'm going to give you a more continuous graph. This might be helpful for the in-class quiz later. I also think this is probably the best way to be able to answer questions about this relationship of elasticity to total revenues. Okay? So let's start out thinking about, I've got quantity, I've got price, I've got my demand curve. Okay? I know that some point in the middle, I don't know where it is exactly, but there is some point where I've got unit elastic demand. We said every point below that, what portion of the demand curve was I on? Inelastic. Hopefully been paying attention to the discussion here. So I know the elasticity in absolute value is less than 1. And any price above that unit elastic point, so let's put a hypothetical price here of 30. Any price above that, I know I'm on the, well, if it's greater than 1, I'm on the elastic portion. Okay? So somewhere in the middle, we've got an elasticity of 1. Every price above that, the elasticity is greater than 1, or I'm on the elastic portion. Well, every price below that, the elasticity is less than 1, I'm on the inelastic portion. So I'm going to kind of match this up. And at the same quantities, I want to graph my total revenues. So what we said, well, here's a way to think about it. Let's say, I don't know, the intercept is like at 100 here. If I charge a price of 100, how many units am I selling? 0, right? So what is my total revenue starting out at? 0, right? Total revenue and quantity are both 0. If I'm on the elastic portion, as I lower the price, that very small percentage change in price is going to result in a very, well, people are very responsive, a much larger percent change in the quantity demanded. So what is going to be happening to my total revenues as I lower the price? They're going to be increasing. Right? This is where you can go through that thought experiment. If I have elastic demand, I have increasing the price lowers total revenue. The opposite is true. If I lower the price, it must be increasing my total revenues. So initially, when I'm in that elastic region, if I lower the price, or I think about it as I'm moving between like these 2 points, what's happening to my total revenues? They are increasing. Once I get to that inelastic portion of my demand curve, well, now if I continue to lower the price, I could lower the price by a lot, right? And people keep buying about the same amount. So if they buy the same amount but at a lower price, my total revenues are going to be going down. So any point past that unit elastic point, if I continue to lower the price, I'm moving to higher and higher quantities. Well, now, by lowering that price, I've actually caused my total revenues to decrease. So this is kind of the graph you want to think about. At that unit elastic point, total revenue is going to be maximized. So if I'm on the elastic portion, to move closer to that maximum point, how do I get higher quantities? I have to lower the price, right? So on this elastic portion, when I lower the price, my total revenues would go up. Well, I could think of the opposite. When I'm on this portion, if I increase the price, what's going to be happening to total revenues? They're going to be going down. If I increase the price, I'm moving to lower quantities. Lower quantities result in my total revenues decreasing. Now, if I'm on the inelastic portion, there, as I was decreasing the price, what was happening to total revenues? They're actually going down. I'm moving further away from that unit elastic point, whereas where total revenue is maximized. And then I could think about it the opposite. So if I'm on the inelastic portion, how do I move closer to that maximum point? Well, I need to move to lower quantities. How can I do that? I'm actually going to want to increase the price. So depending on what portion of the demand curve we're on, we want to do the exact opposite thing to increase total revenue. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So this would be the way I would think about it. If the other way, like if doing the arrows or kind of thinking about one of the other visualizations, that helps more, that's okay. But I think this is probably the way in which you could answer any question. I could do any combination of things. I'm on the elastic portion. What happens if I increase the price? Elastic. What happens if I decrease the price? Inelastic. Increase price. Inelastic. Decrease the price. And ask you in all those scenarios, what happens to total revenue? If you've got this visualization, you can always think about, I want to be increasing total revenues by moving towards that unit elastic point. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? All right. Okay, so we're going to change, switch topics, change gears a little bit here. And we're going to think about, okay, we know if we're looking at the same product, we have different elasticity measures at different points in the demand curve. But we also know that different products, there could be things that change that no matter what point I'm at on that demand curve, it increases the elasticity at every point. Okay. So what are some of those determinants? So the first one we'll think about is the availability of other substitutes. Okay. So if I'm thinking about something like I'm going out to get a fast food hamburger, I can go to Steak Shack, Culver's, Five Guys, McDonald's, right? There's a lot of substitutes. So if one of those companies increases their price, if I have a lot of other available substitutes, what am I more likely to do? Go somewhere else. Right? So how am I responding to their price change? I'm being very responsive. Or if I think about gas prices, if one company or one gas station lowers their price by a couple cents, that's a very small percentage change. What happens? Everybody wants to go to that gas station. They were very responsive. So when you have a lot of available substitutes, everybody wants to go with whoever has the lowest price. They're going to be very responsive to price changes. So they're very responsive to price changes. They would be very elastic. Lots of available substitutes. Consumers are going to be very elastic. Now, if I don't have a lot of available substitutes, right? So I usually kind of think about maybe a relevant example right now, Super Bowl tickets, right? If the price of Super Bowl tickets goes up right now, what do you think happens to the number of tickets they sell? Every year, the Super Bowl is pretty much sold out. So it's going to be very what? People keep buying the same amount, even though the price is higher, they're very inelastic. Now, at some point, the price will be high enough where people can't go, right? They don't have enough money. But in general, these Super Bowl tickets are going to be really inelastic. Why? Because if you want to go to the Super Bowl, are there any substitutes? No. If you really want to go to that event, there is only one event, right? So if you have fewer substitutes, you can't be as responsive to price changes, right? Memorabilia or like signed like jerseys or whatever you think about. Once again, if you really want that, maybe there's not one of them, but there's very few. Right? If I really want a Michael Jordan signed jersey, there's probably only a few that exist. I can't respond to price changes because if I really want that good, I've got to pay whatever price they're charging. I don't have a lot of available substitutes. I'm going to be pretty inelastic. Another one you can think about in terms of different regions, electricity. In most counties, there's only one electric company, right? So if I want electricity, whatever price they're charging, if I want electricity, I have to buy from them. So can I be as responsive to price changes? No, there's not a lot of other substitutes, right? So these goods with fewer substitutes, I'm going to be less elastic, right? More substitutes, I can be more elastic. It's kind of convenient that those things match up, right? Any questions on this idea? This is, I think, fairly straightforward. Now, what might be a little bit less, maybe you haven't thought about this before, it'd be harder to think about. If I'm spending a large proportion of my income on something, what am I more likely to be? Not necessarily elastic, but like if you're going out and you're buying like a new home. Homes are hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Even not great quality homes are above $100,000, right? People will ruin a deal on a house over a couple grand. Now you're like, well, a couple grand is a lot. A couple grand when the house is $100,000 or $200,000 is a very small percent, right? So if a very small percentage change in the price, we can't come to an agreement. My quantity goes from 1 to 0. That's a very large percent change in quantity. So consumers there are very responsive to price change. When something is a large proportion of your income, you want to hunt around for the best deal. If I'm going to be living in this home for 20, I really want to make sure I'm getting a good deal or I'm very responsive to price changes. Okay? So new cars, homes, things that are a really high proportion of your income, people are going to be very responsive to those price changes. Okay? In fact, I always think it's funny. I mean, they do it because it works. But if you look at like these new car ads, they'll be like, come in today and $1,000 is knocked off the price. Okay, so I'm going to pay 50 grand instead of 51. That's a very small percent change in the price, but why are they doing this? It must be convincing consumers to buy a lot more of their cars. Small percent changes in the price are going to cause very large percent change in the quantity demanded if it's a large majority of somebody. Now, maybe it helps to think about the opposite, right? So if I am spending a very low portion of my income on something, so I think I gave you some examples here. The one that I probably mentioned before, I'm cut it down from not being. But I used to have a terrible addiction to fountain, like 44-ounce Diet Mountain Dew drinks from the gas station. If I go into the gas station and the price instead of $1 is $1.50, that's a pretty large percentage change in price. How many of those do you think I bought? The same one. Am I responding at all to that price change? No, because it's a relatively small proportion of my income. So when something's a really small portion of your income, you don't worry about the price as much, right? You keep buying about the same amount or you're going to be fairly inelastic. So when you see things that are a smaller proportion of someone's income, they don't respond as much to even large percentage changes in its price. So maybe it's easier to think about the small proportion of your income and then the exact opposite if it's a large proportion of your income. Does that answer questions? And once again, try to think of a good where this is relative to you. Something you would, have a small proportion of your income and you really aren't that responsive to changes in its price. Any questions before we keep moving here? Okay. Now, the third determinant of demand is directly linked to something we've already talked about. So if I have more time to make a decision, so I'll set this up in terms of airline tickets. I think I've got it on a different slide, but it's a really good example. So if I know I need a flight and I need to be there, I don't have to fly out for another 2 months. What am I going to do for the next 2 months? Hunt around for the best deal, right? I'm going to every single day look to see, okay, what's the current price today? Has it went up? Has it went down? So what am I being? If I'm hunting around waiting to buy this, I'm being very responsive to price changes, right? I'm currently not buying anything because I'm waiting out. I'm trying to find a better deal. Having more time, I can find more substitutes. I can find a lower price from a different airline company. So the more time I have to make a decision, I can be more responsive to the current prices. I can wait and try to find a better price in the future, right? So the more time you have to make a decision, what can you find more of? More substitutes. If I have more substitutes, we said that would make demand more elastic. Now, on the flip side, if I have less time to make a decision, let's say I need to be somewhere and I need to fly out tonight. What do I have to do? Well, whatever the current price of that airline ticket is, I've got to pay that price if I want to get to where I want to go. So if I don't have a lot of time to make a decision, I have to pay whatever the current prices are. Can I be as responsive to those? No. So I have less time to make a decision. I can't find as many other substitutes. I'm not going to be able to respond to the changes in the current price. Any questions on this idea? So we've got these 3 determinants of demand. I'm going to try to use some measures. This was, I forget what government organization I put out that did this study. And they tried to look at different elasticities of different products. I just grabbed a few of them here, but I think it helps with some of the things we've talked about. Now, sometimes we'll have goods where like all 3 of those things don't point to the same direction, right? They don't, it might kind of be counter effects, right? So here I've got a couple goods where at least they're all pushing things in the same direction. So if I think about like a book of matches, right? Like this is like, you know, it's a little book that goes away and I just need a box of matches. Is that going to be a relatively high or sort of small portion of my income? Pretty small. So that's going to make me pretty inelastic, right? Are there other substitutes? Well, I get a lighter, right? That's really the only other substitute. If let's say I want a cigarette, it's the only way to light my cigarette right now, right? So if there's fewer substitutes, that's going to make the product more inelastic. It's also, if I want to light something on fire, right? Usually when I matches, I want to do that right now. So if I have less time to make a decision, am I going to be more or less elastic? The price change isn't that good. All 3 things would point to the book of matches is pretty inelastic, and sure enough, it has an elasticity measure of 0.1, right? Now, on the flip side, if I have brand new automobiles, right, and I'm thinking about purchasing a brand new car, and I'm thinking about specifically a Chevy, right, one specific brand. If I want to buy a brand new car, are there a lot of other substitutes buying a Chevy? I could buy a Ford, I could buy a Nissan, I could buy an electric instead of a gas-powered car. There's a lot of other substitutes. So is that going to make me more or less elastic to changes in the price of that Chevy car? More elastic. Is it a high or low proportion of my income? For most of us, Elon Musk being included, this is going to be a relatively high portion of our income, making us more elastic, right? If I'm thinking about buying a new car, generally people don't need to buy a new car today, right? They have a current car, they're thinking about upgrading, they can make a decision over the next couple months. More time I have to make a decision is going to make it more elastic. All those 3 things point to this being a pretty elastic product. And we see an elasticity measure well above 1. Now, the other thing in this table that I like is if I look at airline tickets are the same portion of my income if I need them tomorrow or next month. I have the same available substitutes. I can choose to drive, or I can choose to do all these other things. The only thing that I'm changing here, and I believe the way they measure this was if people buy a ticket within 1 week of the flight, or people buy a ticket within anything above 1 week. So that was the differentiation between long and short. So all the difference here is we have is time. If I have more time before I need that airline ticket, is that going to make it more or less elastic? More elastic. I can look for better deals, so I don't have to pay the current price. Sure enough, we see it's an elastic good. But that same good, if I have to have that ticket within a week, what is the elasticity measure? 0.1. It's a very inelastic product. Okay? So if I'm a company, I'm thinking about, I want to charge higher prices. I want a more inelastic product for that increase in price to increase my total revenues. I want to try to choose goods where these determinants of demand suggest it would be inelastic. So we don't have to just like use hypothetical numbers. We can get these values from data. We can look at month-to-month, day-to-day changes in prices and quantities sold to determine whether or not we're currently at a point where that good is elastic or inelastic. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay with this? Okay. I'm not going to spend time on this. At one point, I thought this was interesting. If we have time, I usually go through it, but I want to save time for some other stuff today. You can look at like a product, a similar product group. So like all of this is different types of alcohol. These are all technically substitutes of each other, but some of them are categories where there might not be as many substitutes, right? So for the ones that there aren't as many substitutes, so this would be like, I don't know, like, I don't think they have it broken down here, but like really good, you know, high produced whiskeys, there's not as many substitutes. We tend to see that it's more inelastic. Things that are just like pre-mixed drinks, you can buy like there's a ton of different companies. They're all like the same. People tend to be a lot more elastic. So we could look at like a similar product group, and for slightly different products in that group, we could see different elasticity measures as well. It doesn't have to just be very different goods, right? So the next thing we're going to focus on is we're going to move away from the price elasticity of demand to thinking about different elasticity measures. Okay? So I'll kind of walk through this, right? If we instead of the price elasticity of demand for a product, that was a change in the price of that good and a change in the quantity of that good. If we wanted to look at a cross price elasticity, we're saying if another product's price changes, so product Y has a price change, if that influences the amount that I'm buying of good X, that must mean they are either substitutes or complements. If the cross price elasticity was 0, these two goods are completely unrelated. The price of airline tickets goes up or down, doesn't change how many fast food hamburgers I want to buy. Right? So here we're now thinking about it's a measure of responsiveness, but not to a change in the price of the good we're looking at its demand for, the change in the price of some other good. So the sign of this cross price elasticity will tell us if there's substitutes or complements. So I'll walk through kind of why that is, maybe give you a more complete way to remember this. Okay? So if I've got my cross price elasticity between good X and good Y, the thing I tried to kind of hammer this home last class, but what's in our denominator is the thing that is changing. So for a cross price elasticity, it's not a percentage change in the price of good X, it's the change in the price of some other good. And then in response to that change, what's happening to the quantity demanded of good X? Okay. So if I saw the price of good Y go up, and as a result, people bought more of good X. So we already talked about this concept. If the price of Y goes up, maybe a good kind of example to anchor this idea to is two goods that you know for sure are substitutes, Coke and Pepsi. If the price of Coke goes up, are people going to be more or less likely to buy Pepsi now? More likely. All right, they want to buy the product that has a relatively lower price. What are increases? That would be a positive change in my price of the other good, a positive change in the price, or sorry, quantity of the X good I'm looking at. So what's going to be true about my cross price elasticity? Greater than 0. This tells me that they are substitute goods. Okay. I could instead think about, well, what if I lowered the price of Coke? What should that do? Well, that means people are going to be more likely to buy Coke, less likely to buy Pepsi, but a negative over a negative is still a positive value. So it doesn't matter what direction I see this price change. If the cross price elasticity is positive, that tells me they're substitute goods. If instead I see that the price of some good goes up, and as a result, people buy less of good X, this is the idea. If the price of batteries goes up, maybe this is a good example to kind of anchor to this idea. If the price of batteries goes up, and let's say this is for electric vehicles, what happens to the quantity of electric vehicles? Well, if I need the battery to use this vehicle, I'm going to decrease the amount or be less likely to buy it. So that's going to be what? A positive change in my denominator, a negative change in my numerator. If my cross price elasticity is negative, this tells me that these two goods are complements. I use them at the same time. So unlike the price elasticity of demand, here the sign matters, right? The sign tells me whether or not they're substitute or complementary goods. Now, in terms of whether or not they're elastic or inelastic, you would still look at the absolute value there, right? If in absolute terms that cross price elasticity is greater than 1, just like before, we would say that the cross price elasticity is elastic. If it's less than 1, we would still say it's inelastic, right? And I say less than 1, it's in absolute terms, right? We care about the sign, though, because the sign tells us whether or not they are substitutes or complements. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah, so if I increase the price, what's the percentage change in price? Positive. If that causes a decrease in the quantity demanded, that change would be negative. Yep. Just a different way of thinking about it. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So another elasticity we can measure and might care about, especially when we're kind of determining like the proportion of some like what types of good these are. So I think in the slides and maybe in the e-text, I said because of macroeconomics, I represent something different. Income is usually represented by M. I'm always, just for the sake of this class and like exams and quizzes, I'll actually write out the word income just because it's a little bit easier. I'm not trying to trick you. So our income elasticity, once again, what's in our denominator? It's the thing that's changing. And what's in our numerator? It's the thing that's responding. So if I want the income elasticity of demand, the first word we say, price elasticity of demand, the cross price, that's the thing that's changing. So now I've got a percentage change in income. And it's kind of easy because every single elasticity we look at, what are we measuring? What is responding? The percentage change in the quantity of good X. Right? So we can go through the same thought experiment. If I see an increase in income, and as a result, people buy more of this X good. Okay? We said if I have more income and I buy more of something, that tells me it's a what type of good from last module. If you have more money, you buy more of something, that is most goods or normal goods. Right? So there, what would my income elasticity be? Well, if income goes up, that's a positive change. If as a result I buy more, that's a positive change. Anytime this income elasticity is positive, that's telling me these are normal goods. I could work in the exact opposite direction, though. If I saw income go down and as a result people bought less, that still tells me it's a normal good. I've got a negative change over a negative change. Negative over a negative is a positive value. Anytime anytime my income elasticity demand is positive, I've got a normal good. If instead I think about what if my income elasticity is less than 0? Well, that would mean that when my income goes up, I'm actually buying less of this product, or I had a positive change in income, a negative change in my quantity. Negative over a positive is a negative value. If I have more money and I buy less of something, that was things we said that we didn't really want to be buying them to begin with. They were inferior products. And then you could have the exact opposite, right? If I saw income go down, and as a result, people bought more of this good, I'd have a what? Positive change over negative change. I still have this negative income elasticity of demand. Anytime that income elasticity of demand is negative, that's telling me it's an inferior product. And that kind of helps. Like that one's kind of intuitive. A positive income elasticity, they're normal goods. Negative income elasticity are these goods we don't really want to be buying, or these inferior products. Any questions on this idea? So instead of like trying to rote memorize these, I think it helps to try to like construct this on your own when you're thinking about these problems. Try to rote memorize for this. Like I said, there's just a lot to do to rote memorize. So I would try to be able to kind of work through these concepts similar to what we just did here. So one question I might expect if you went through the module reading of the e-text, but I'm going to tell you right now. So we had our cross price elasticity kind of summary, income elasticity summary. I am not going to ask you about this, right? The kind of differentiation between necessity and luxury goods, really just creating categories. It's just not going to be something I ask you questions. Right? What I would ask you questions on, if I have a normal good, if a change in the price results in me, if there's a change in income and it results in me responding a lot to that, right? So this would be if I have if I have a small percentage change in my income, the response to my demand might go up by a lot. Well, the elasticity of income there is going to be something very, we might call these luxury goods. Okay? If it's less than 1, somewhere in between 0 and 1, we would kind of call these necessity goods. I'm not going to expect you to know this. What I will expect you to know when it comes to the income elasticity and the cross price elasticity is just what does the sign of those elasticities tell you? What we already kind of covered. Now, what I could ask you, and what I might expect to know is, let's say I had an income elasticity of negative, I know that if it's negative, that tells me the two goods are complements. And if I asked you, is that income elasticity elastic or inelastic? Well, there I look at to determine if it's elastic or inelastic, simply the absolute value. So if it's 3, that tells me that income elasticity was elastic. Right? That people were very responsive to income changes in terms of how much they chose to buy that good. If I instead had an income elasticity of 0.5, well, that tells me it's a positive sign that tells me it's a normal good. But am I very responsive to how much I buy that good when my income changes? No. That's why we say they're necessity goods. Even if my income goes up, yeah, I might buy a little bit more electricity. I might not be as careful about what I'm doing at my home, about how much I'm using, but I still need about the same amount of electricity. I'm not going to be very responsive to having more money all of a sudden, right? So I won't ask you to kind of use these definitions. All I'm going to expect you to know is what does the sign tell you, and could you say is it elastic or inelastic? And those are the same 3 ranges we've been using already. Okay. So is your income elasticity greater than 1? If we were to go into this, I consider you a luxury good. All right. So maybe use this I wish I had data to see the success rate, but here we are, right? So before we kind of go to that last topic, we are now going to look at, and I believe I have this set correctly. We're just looking at time. We're already a little bit past time here. So I'm going to do, 10:37 here. Well, no, I might be kind today. Right? So let's do 10:35. I'm going to save and publish this. So I believe the code for today is 10.20 or 10.20. Okay. So if we look at this quiz, right? 10:35. All I want you to do is answer the first question. Okay. So if I'm looking at this, I want you to kind of work through this first question and answer it in, I don't know, at 10:35. I'm going to go back and change this to be a little bit later just to give you a little bit more time to kind of work through this. So 10:37. All you have to do is work through that very first question, and I am going to tell you the answers to the second question. So if I'm looking at this quiz, right? The third question, everybody should get right as long as you respond to it. Okay. So that third question is simply, what module do you want to see the most review of on Tuesday's class? Okay. So if I'm looking at this, just respond with anything and you'll get it correct. Here, if I'm looking at this cross price elasticity, it's negative. That tells me they're complements and it's above an absolute value of 1. So that percentage change in quantity demanded is, the percentage change in price must be less than, right? So complements and less than should be the answer to question 2. I'll give you a couple minutes, 3-4 minutes here to kind of come up with the answer in 1. I'll then prompt you to make sure you're getting this quiz submitted. We'll review the answers for question 1 and question 2, and then we'll kind of move on to one more topic to end class. Okay? Not loading. I can't hear you. Because price changes on the it's that's bad. The goal. All right. So make sure, this is where I kind of give you a buffer. Make sure you're answering all three of these questions. All right. We said the answer to 2 is complements and less than. Make sure you're getting your response in for question 1. And any response will be counted as correct for question 3, but you have to respond. Okay. Make sure you're getting that submitted. I have it set to be 10:37. So you got the next minute or so making sure you're getting that submitted. Right. This is where if you submit it after that time, it's 0. I'm assuming you weren't here. Right. So I am going to make sure you're hitting submit because I'm not going to review this in time for you to make sure you're getting the answer correct. Okay. So let's now think about, okay, if I got that first question, the relationship between elasticity and total revenues. We said at the unit elastic point, total revenues are maximized, correct? The shape of our total revenue curve looked like this. Okay? So if I'm at the unit elastic point, my elasticity of demand is equal to what? 1. If I move down my demand curve, my elasticity is getting closer to 0, or this portion of my demand curve, the elasticity is getting less than 1, so I must be on the inelastic portion. Okay. So I believe this problem was telling you you have an elasticity measure of 0.4 in absolute terms. If it's less than 1, you're on the inelastic portion. So if I increase the price from 4 to 5, I'm telling you that between those two prices, the elasticity measure was 0.4. Okay? That was the kind of setup of the problem. If I am increasing the price, what is happening to my total revenues? Well, if I increase the price, I'm lowering the quantity. I'm seeing that I'm getting closer and closer to that maximum point, or my total revenues they're getting higher. My total revenues are increasing. Right? Now, if I was on the elastic portion and I increase the price, what would be happening to my total revenues? Quantity is going down here. So if I increase the price, my total revenues would be going down. So this is why I said earlier, I would use this graph to understand that relationship between elasticities, changes in price, and how that would correspond to then changes in total revenue. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving? Okay. Now I think for the second one, I told you I'm looking at a cross price elasticity, and it's equal to negative 3.2. Now you could go back to the notes what we just talked about and said, well, I know that it's negative. I know that tells me they are complements, right? Or I could think about, okay, what I'm measuring with a cross price elasticity, remember, what's in my denominator? The thing that is changing, so price of the other good. What is responding? The amount that people are buying of this other good, right? Of the X good as opposed to the good that had a change in its price. If this is negative, what I could think about that means is if the price of good Y goes up, which was a positive change, the only way that this is negative is if my numerator is negative. So when the price of good Y went up, if people bought less of good X, that's telling me that, once again, you could kind of anchor this to a good that makes sense to you. If I had the price of, let's say I do the price of Coke, and I think about the quantity of Pepsi. If the price of Coke went up, what should happen to a substitute? I should buy more of it. So here, I'm like, oh, Well, if the cross price elasticity was positive, that means they're actually substitutes. It must be these are complements. And then I could say, okay, would this make sense if it was complementary goods? Maybe I think about the price of batteries goes up. What happens to electric vehicles, right? The electric vehicle batteries. Well, there people would be less like, oh yeah, these would be positive over negative. These would be complements. Right? So anchoring, kind of having two examples that really make sense for you of complementary goods and then another for substitute goods is really going to help with questions like this. Okay. Now, the second part of the question, if this fraction in absolute value is greater than 1, right? So in absolute value, this was 3.2. What has to be true about my percentage change in the quantity of good X relative to that percentage change in the price of good Y if this fraction is above 1? The numerator has to be, once again, if we are struggling with the idea of when fractions are less than or greater than 1, we need to have this solidified, right? So the only way this fraction is above 1 is if the numerator is greater than the denominator, right? And that was the second part of the question, right? I think the way it was phrased was the percentage change in the price must be less than the percentage change in quantity, which is why I gave you that. Right? It's the way that this question was phrased, right? You could say it either way, right? Any questions on this? Okay. All right. So this is where I might have to start using these a little bit earlier in class if people are just going to take off on me after we use them. So, that means that you have to get here even earlier in the future. It's not that, you guys are all still here, so I'm talking to the wrong group, right? But we have one more thing that we're going to want to work through, which is I can also, and this is where it won't be a lot of new stuff. It's going to be exactly what we were doing before, just apply it to something different. So when we talked about the price elasticity of demand, we can also measure the price elasticity of supply. So not how responsive are consumers, but how responsive are producers. Well, here it's kind of nice. So now it's still that same percentage change in the price of a good, but it's now not the percentage change in the quantity demanded, it's the percentage change just in the quantity supplied. So instead of using the demand curve, I'd be getting my quantities simply from the supply curve. What will the sign of my elasticity of supply always be? Price goes up, producers want to supply more. We don't have to worry about the absolute value, it's always positive. And then is the price elasticity of supply elastic, inelastic, or inelastic? Same exact thing we were doing with demand, right? It's greater than 1, it's elastic, less than 1, inelastic, equal to 0, unit elastic. How would I calculate these percent changes? Using the exact same midpoint method. If I want the percentage change in the quantity supplied, I would look at the change between the quantity supplied at the two different points and divide that by the average of those two. It's really nothing different. Right? We're just getting these values from the supply curve or for the producers as opposed to the demand curve for consumers. Okay? Now, we can think about kind of some things that will change supply, right? Whether or not it's more or less elastic. So if I have more flexibility in my production process, can I be more or less responsive to current changes in price? More flexibility means I can be more responsive. I can kind of pivot, right? So I always think about more flexibility. The best example I think of is if I have a production facility and I have like extra capacity. So currently, if the price is low, maybe I'm only using like 80% of my production facility. If all of a sudden the price goes up by a lot and I have this extra capacity to make it more, I now can be very responsive to that price change. I can produce a lot more because I have this extra space or extra capabilities in my facility. So this is why you would want to have excess capacity, right? So that when prices go up, you can be very responsive. You can produce a lot more units and get your product out there when the price is high. If I'm already at I'm constrained, like I'm producing as many units as possible in my facility, if the price goes up, what is my response? I'm already maxed out. I can't respond to that price change at all. I'm very inelastic when I don't have any flexibility. Okay. Also, like maybe relocation. Right. Maybe I want to make sure my production process, if I had to, I could relocate to different states if taxes change in the state I'm in, right? Or something changes, like kind of the current prices or costs. The more flexible I can be, the more elastic I can be as a producer. Said differently, something else that would tie into this, just like for consumers, it works the exact same way. If I have more time to make my production decision, so let's say I don't have to have this product out for another month, I can try to find workers who are willing to work for less. I can maybe replace the raw materials I'm using with, I go to a different, like maybe I'm making out of plastic, I go to some different kind of seller of plastic to get my raw material. The more time I have to make the production decision, the more responsive I could be to current prices. Right? If the current price is low, and I don't have to worry about my profits over the next year, I can hold out, not sell as much today, and try to get more of my product out there in another month or two. Right? So more time, I can be more flexible, which makes my which makes my price elasticity of supply more elastic. And then the less time I have, the less flexibility, it makes me less responsive to current price changes or less elastic. So with this idea in mind, I have an interesting example where we can start to take some of what we're talking about and put it to real world examples. But they might seem a little bit weird, right? So the one I'm going to start out here when I'm thinking about supply. So in the 90s, the Sudanese slave trade was huge, right? And these humanitarian groups were like, we've got a solution. We're going to go in there. We're going to pay higher prices than what people in Sudan are paying for these slaves, and we'll then set them free. Sounds like a great idea. But if I pay a higher price, what happens to the quantity supplied of something? Goes up. Even if I barely outbid people, if supply is very elastic, even paying a slightly higher price for slaves is going to cause a very large percent change in the quantity supplied. So when these groups went in there and paid just slightly higher prices to kind of win the bet or win the bid for these slaves and then set them free, what happened? The quantity supplied of slaves went way up, right? These people in Sudan went out and enslaved as many people as possible, right? So even though they were well-intentioned, what happened, right? Well, supply of slaves was very elastic. It actually made things worse. You can look at the data, and that's actually what happened. When these humanitarian groups went in there, we actually saw the number of people being enslaved in this country in the 90s actually increase. So you can take these ideas and apply them to very real-world examples. Okay. The other example I have kind of in here, and this is I'll talk through it and link it to something I talked about at the beginning of class. So these economic experiments, they'll run these. And this paper is like a published article, and they kind of go through it. So they found 120 heroin users, and they ran these economic experiments with them. They gave them hypothetical budgets and hypothetical prices for both heroin and cocaine. Running these experiments, what they found was that the cross-price elasticity, that when cocaine was higher, that people actually bought less heroin in these experiments. Or they find a cross-price elasticity that was negative, which tells you that those two goods are constant, right? Now, I can't vouch for the actual use of heroin and cocaine here, but right from this experiment, from actual heroin users, we have data now. We don't have to guess what those two goods are. From the actual data, we can show that for heroin users, cocaine is a complementary good, right? So we can take these concepts, go out and collect data, and actually determine what type of goods these are, okay? Now, the experiments here on campus aren't using heroin users, they're using college students, but this is kind of what you would do. Have hypothetical prices, hypothetical budgets, and then make decisions, okay? So we'll talk more about the exam and do review on Tuesday's class. You'll kind of know a week from today is that first exam. Want to make sure you're here early, ready to start on time, okay? Have a fun, safe weekend. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.